John Ashworth and his wife Jane had two sons, John and William, who both died in infancy. One died very suddenly when he was about a year old, and the other was scalded and died when he was about 4. Both were laid to rest in St. Stephen's Churchyard in Rochdale, now Ball Street Gardens. St. Stephen's Church was demolished in 1949. The Ashworths had 2 more sons. Felix was born in about 1833 and Harold in 1839. Mr. Ashworth said, "One of the masters in town came to my employer, requesting he would lend me for a few days to help him to finish some urgent work. The few days extended to several years, and I ultimately became his foreman. At last, he, wishing to retire from business, offered me his entire stock at a valuation. With much fear and anxiety I accepted the offer, and thus found myself, instead of a journeyman, a master." One Sunday during the time of the Chartist agitation, John Ashworth was on his way to speak at Hartley, a preaching station in Rochdale. As he was going through an area called Stony Fields, he came across some men who were discussing the Chartist and land schemes and denouncing all parsons and chapel-going people. By the time they arrived at Hartley, Mr. Ashworth had persuaded the men to go into the service with him. In after years, when he became better known, the young men, when they saw Mr. Ashworth approaching, would prepare themselves for a short speech, for they knew he would never pass them without a word of advice for their good. As a young preacher, John Ashworth remembered sitting by the fireside with 4 other gentlemen and listening to them share their experiences of God. These 4 men included Mr. Ashworth's father-in-law, William Thornber, Samuel Heap, John Griffiths, and John Mills. John Griffiths was a fiery Welshman who apparently witnessed more conversions than most men of his time. As a preacher of the gospel, Griffiths carefully thought over and prayed over his texts. He worked as a clerk in an office, and once instantly wrote down a new thought on a piece of paper lying on the desk so he wouldn't forget it, not realising what had looked like a slip of waste paper was actually a 10-shilling stamp, lying with its face down. Griffiths was a very popular and intensely earnest preacher, and crowds flocked to hear him. John Mills was with Griffiths in most of his engagements. Mills said wherever Brother Griffiths went, signs and wonders followed. Although their graves are no longer visible, John Griffiths and John Mills are both buried near the entrance gates of the new burial ground at St. Chad's Parish Church. John Ashworth records more stories of old in his narrative Old Abe, including the tale of how, when John Wesley arrived in Rochdale on horseback to preach in the 1700s, the people of the town announced, "Wesley is come." Mr. Wesley arrived at the old Clock Face, a small public house in a narrow part of the town called Blackwater Street, but as the stables at the Clock Face were all occupied, his horse apparently had to be stalled in the bottom room of a tin plate worker's shop in a place called White Bear Yard, belonging to James Hamilton. Blackwater Street and White Bear Yard were located near the Rochdale Exchange Shopping Centre car park entrance on Hunter's Lane, opposite Toad Lane and the Rochdale Pioneers Museum. James Hamilton wanted to start a Sunday school, so he asked a man called Robert Raikes for instruction. Mr. Raikes advised him to get the children together and teach them to read and write and take them to some place of worship as often as possible. In 1784, James Hamilton began the first Sunday school in his tin shop, in the same room down the White Bear Yard in which Mr. Wesley's horse was stabled. An acquaintance of his, called John Croft, also asked to be a teacher. On the first Sunday there were 6 scholars at the school, and on the second Sunday there were 13. By the 9th Sunday there were 23 scholars, so Mr. Raikes took the dirty children in procession to St. Chad's Parish Church, but when they got to the door, the beadle, with his red collar and long black staff and silver knob, sternly refused them admittance. James Hamilton told him it was a Sunday school and they must be admitted, which enraged the mighty beadle. He took out some handcuffs, after which John Croft took to his heels down the 122 steps. But Hamilton stood firm. Apparently an old vicar allowed them in, saying, "Put them in the corner out of sight." When he relayed the tale, John Ashworth concluded, "It would be a large corner that would hold that same school now, for it numbers 1,200, and many thousands more are taught in the valley, not only to read, but their way to a better world." The area around the 122 steps behind St. Chad's Parish Church was once known as the Gank. During the 1800s, the Gank was a notorious slum area in Rochdale. It was packed with houses of ill repute and backstreet pubs, and was the scene of robberies, riots, brawls and murders. One of the streets within the Gank was King Street, now a simple narrow cobbled road which runs parallel to Church Lane and Drake Street and leads out onto South Parade and the Butts. In 1841 John Ashworth and his wife Jane lived on King Street with their children Felix and Harold. In the 1800s there was a place called the Wood on the banks of the River Roach near the old stone bridge, or Cap Ogden Bridge. Here John Ashworth met Joseph Sutcliffe, the focus of a narrative he entitled Joseph, or the Silent Corner. According to Mr. Ashworth, the Wood was a favourite resort of invalids, had much the appearance of a private walk, and was free from the noise and throng of the streets. Joseph Sutcliffe was a tall, handsome young man, and was a cotton mill worker, a warper, who was living at a lodging house called Smith's on King Street. He considered himself very lonely and very miserable, and reasoned that he was beyond the reach of God's love, but Mr. Ashworth helped him to see otherwise, and he came to repentance. A local woman sent her daughter Rachel to read the 103rd Psalm to Joseph. Amazingly, this happened to be his mother's favourite psalm, and John Ashworth saw this as evidence of God's love and goodness to the sorrowful young man. Like many of John Ashworth's acquaintances, when he died, Joseph Sutcliffe was buried in the paupers' portion of St. Chad's churchyard, in an area known as the Silent Corner. John Ashworth said, "It is easy to distinguish the stranger's portion, for while the rest of the ground is covered with memorials, this part is as bare as the common, though very many are known to be interred there." Mr. Ashworth said, "If the question be asked, who sleeps there, we must wait till the sound of the last trump for an answer. Then the dead, small and great, will come forth, and many from these obscure resting places, to a glorious resurrection." 24-year-old Joseph Sutcliffe was buried in the Silent Corner on the 5th of August 1841. On their son Harold's third birthday, 25th of March 1842, John and Jane Ashworth had a daughter named Mary Jane. According to Mr. Ashworth, King Street, or Packer Meadow, where they lived, was considered by the inhabitants of Rochdale as anything but a respectable section of the town. He said, "One or two of the residents in the lower part are in moderate circumstances, but at the upper end the houses are of the most wretched description. A man called John Sanderson occupied one of the better houses. Sanderson was a morose and untamed character who didn't believe in heaven or hell, God or the devil, and hated parsons so much that he said if any parson dared to enter his room he would smash his brains out with a poker. Sanderson was a machine card maker by trade, and had a dark, red, bushy-tailed dog called Fox. When he was about 35, Sanderson became very ill. His looks altered, he got a severe cough, and he had to keep to his room because he was unable to walk up and down the stairs. John Ashworth asked Alice, a little girl from the Sunday school who knew Sanderson, to recite a hymn to him when she went to see him, and this led to his conversion. Apparently the change in Sanderson made a noise in the neighbourhood. He was now a happy man, and spoke to old and young of the power of God's saving grace. Mr. Ashworth concluded that reconciliation, union, and communion with God are absolutely necessary to secure the happiness of man. After Sanderson's change of heart, he recovered strength and began to attend church, but one day he was caught in a heavy shower of rain and got a severe cold, which made him bedridden again. John Sanderson died at the age of 37. He was buried at St. Chad's on the 10th of May, 1842. One day an elderly gentleman named William Harrison, who lived with his son and his family on Drake Street, appealed for John Ashworth's help after his daughter-in-law spoke to him sharply for touching the polished part of the fender with his foot after she'd cleaned it. Mr. Harrison asked if he may move in with the Ashworths, for he said he could not stand living at home any longer. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth were happy to oblige, but then Mr. Harrison's son came to help his dear father back to his right home, saying, "You little know how proud I am of my father, and how thankful I am that God has so prospered me that I can pay back some little of what I owe by providing you every comfort in your declining years." God's Spirit moved John Ashworth to concern about the salvation of an intelligent publican by the name of Wilkins. Wilkins felt it a waste of time to read either the Old or the New Testament, but when he did, it led to his conversion. When Wilkins read the New Testament, he wished he had done so 30 years earlier, saying if he had, he'd have been a different man. A neighbour called Mr. Todd promised to read and pray with Wilkins 50 times a day if he wished. Wilkins shed tears of anguish over his sins, which turned to tears of joy as he praised God. As he came to faith late on in life, Mr. Ashworth said of Wilkins, "You have been saved by the skin of your teeth." John Ashworth had agreed to pay his old master for the stock he had taken on in regular instalments, but said the master became a perfect torment, and at times would walk into his house telling him that he could not and would not wait, that he had made him what he was, and he ought to pay him and thank him. Mr. Ashworth said he often found his wife in tears, and on asking the reason was told, "He has been again." On the day on which they finally paid off their relentless creditor, Mr. Ashworth was in a happy state of mind, and walked through his shop into the sitting room to tell his wife they were no longer indebted to him. But he said, "I soon found that troubles are great or small only relatively, and what seemed a great trouble yesterday may sink into insignificance compared with the one we have today." On entering the room he found 3 doctors there, who had just finished a consultation. For several months Mrs. Ashworth had felt great pain in walking. The family had their own medical man who had been calling in almost daily, but he, not willing to take the responsibility upon himself, had called in 2 other surgeons. They urged immediate action and agreed that the immediate amputation of Mrs. Ashworth's foot was necessary to save her life. Mr. Ashworth's wife Jane had heard the decision and sat in the chair with her face covered to hide her tears and agony. The Ashworths wept together, and their 3 children, Felix, Harold and Mary Jane, were called into the room and gently told what was coming. Mr. Ashworth said, "They all threw their arms round our necks, frantic with grief, and begged that if possible it might not be, but were told it must be or mother would die." After a sleepless night, the morning of the operation came, and Jane was calm and ready at the moment fixed. An affectionate and tried female friend, ever ready for every good work, came to be with her during the operation. She was a woman of strong faith but few words. She knelt down in one corner of the room in silent prayer, and rose with the words, "All things work together for good to them that love God." Mrs. Ashworth gradually declined in health until she was entirely confined to her room and then to her bed. John Ashworth said, "The trying time for my dear suffering wife was again come. The last foe was approaching, not to take a foot, but her body to the tomb." He said, "As a rule, people die as they have lived. When I first saw my wife, young as she was then a Christian. And now, after many years of happy married life, as she droops by my side, she is still a Christian, and the rapturous felicity, the joys unspeakable, of the last few weeks of her life can never be told." A short time before breathing her last, Mrs. Ashworth desired to hear her aged father pray once more before she died. John Ashworth went to tell old William Thornborough of his daughter's request, and with quivering lips and swimming eyes the old man put on his broad-brimmed hat and took hold of John Ashworth's arm, and in silence walked on with him to witness the last sad scene. Mrs. Ashworth received her father with a smile, and he knelt down without saying a word for a long time. At last Mr. Thornborough spoke, and Mr. Ashworth said, "Oh, what a prayer!" We rose from our knees in tears, but the dying one had no tears. She was too happy for that, being on the verge of that place where tears are never shed. She smiled and whispered, "It sounds like old times, father. Farewell." Jane Ashworth died and was buried in St. Stephen's churchyard.